Xander tightened the straps on his utility harness, scanning the rocky landscape ahead. The atmosphere was thin but breathable, the gravity slightly lighter than Earth's. He took a steadying breath before glancing at his partner, Victor, who was adjusting his oxygen monitor. "You sure about this?" Victor asked, his voice laced with apprehension. "That cave system looks unstable." "We don't have a choice," Xander replied. "The research team is still inside. If we don't get them out now, they might not make it." Behind them, the alien students from the Zilvaar Academy observed with a mix of curiosity and trepidation. The Zilvaar were a species known for their meticulous approach to risk assessment, rarely engaging in direct action without thorough calculations. The idea of rushing into a dangerous situation was, to them, an act of reckless desperation. One of the students, Kalos, stepped forward. His bioluminescent skin pulsed with uncertainty. "Humans, when overwhelmed by fear, your species should freeze. Our studies indicate that high stress impairs your cognitive function to a dangerous degree." Xander gave a humorless chuckle. "Then your studies are missing a few details." He turned back toward the cave, activating the headlamp on his helmet. Victor exhaled sharply. "All right, let's do this." The two men disappeared into the dark passage, their footsteps crunching against loose rock. Kalos hesitated before following, along with two other Zilvaar students. "We will assist, though your approach is unprecedented." Inside, the air was thick with dust. The cave walls trembled slightly, a warning of further collapses. Xander kept his focus ahead, scanning for signs of movement. "There!" Victor pointed toward a dim cluster of figures huddled near a jagged rock formation. Professor Harding, the lead researcher, looked up as they approached. His face was streaked with dirt, his leg pinned beneath a heavy slab of stone. Two of his assistants were beside him, their expressions filled with relief and exhaustion. "We didn't think anyone would make it in," Harding wheezed. "Save the reunion for later," Xander said. He crouched beside the professor, assessing the situation. "Your leg, can you feel anything?" "Barely. Could be a crush injury," Victor muttered. "We need to get that rock off, but we have to do it carefully." Kalos observed the scene, his eyes flickering with unease. "This is inefficient. You should focus on self-preservation." Xander shot him a look. "That's not how we do things." Victor positioned himself on one side of the rock. "We lift on 3. Xander nodded, gripping the rough surface. 1, 2, 3. The moment they heaved, the ground beneath them shifted. A deep rumble echoed through the cavern, and Xander barely had time to register the sound before a series of rocks tumbled from the ceiling. Kalos and the other Zilvaar reacted instantly, using their elongated limbs to push Professor Harding and his assistants out of the way. Xander and Victor barely managed to dodge the falling debris, but a sharp pain shot through Xander's shoulder as a smaller rock struck him. He gritted his teeth, pushing through the pain. "We need to move," Victor said. "Now." Kalos hesitated. "Your injury—" "I'll deal with it later," Xander snapped. He turned to Harding. "Can you walk?" "With help." Victor slung one of Harding's arms over his shoulder, while Xander took the other side. The cave groaned around them, another warning that time was running out. Kalos took the lead, guiding them toward the exit. He moved with efficiency, but his glowing eyes kept darting back to Xander, as if perplexed by the human's refusal to stop despite his injury. The moment they emerged from the cave, the ground behind them caved in completely. A cloud of dust billowed out, swallowing the entrance. Xander lowered Harding onto the ground, his shoulder throbbing. "You're injured," Kalos said, his tone more insistent now. Xander gave a tired grin. "Yeah, well, you should see the other guy." Kalos stared for a long moment before shaking his head. "Your species does not behave as expected." Victor let out a breathless laugh. "You're just figuring that out now?" Kalos exchanged glances with his fellow students. "We believed fear would paralyze you, that in such a crisis you would hesitate." Xander met his gaze. "Fear doesn't stop us. It just reminds us what's at stake." Kalos said nothing, but the glow in his eyes shifted, a flicker of something resembling understanding. Victor pressed a hand against his knee, catching his breath as the dust from the cave-in settled. The air was thick with the scent of disturbed earth and sweat. Xander shifted his weight, testing his injured shoulder. A dull, persistent ache pulsed through it. But he had full movement, nothing broken, just bruised. That was the least of their concerns. Professor Harding leaned against a jagged rock, his face pale. His assistants hovered nearby, dazed but unharmed. The Zilvaar students stood at a careful distance, their expressions unreadable, bioluminescent markings flickering in a pattern Xander couldn't decipher. Kalos stepped forward, his elongated fingers twitching. His gaze flicked between Xander and Harding. "Your physiology is compromised. Immediate intervention is required." Victor exhaled sharply. "We don't have a med station out here. Closest one is back at the outpost." "Is unwise," another Zilvaar student interjected. "This terrain is unstable. Further collapses may occur." Xander rolled his good shoulder, testing his range of motion. "We're out of options. We can't stay here." Kalos hesitated, then turned to one of his peers. A brief, rapid exchange of their native tongue passed between them before Kalos refocused on Xander. "We possess limited field medical training. If permitted, we will assist." Victor glanced at Xander, who gave a nod. "Do it." Two of the Zilvaar crouched beside Harding, their elongated limbs moving with eerie precision. One examined his leg, while the other retrieved a small metallic device from a pouch. Xander watched as they scanned the professor's injury, a faint hum emitting from the tool. The alien's expression darkened. "The limb is not broken, but severe tissue damage is present. Circulation is compromised." Victor frowned. "We don't have anything to stabilize it properly." Kalos extended a slim, translucent band from another compartment in his gear. "This will apply controlled pressure and adjust temperature for optimal recovery. It will not heal, but it will prevent deterioration." Without hesitation, Kalos secured the device around Harding's leg. The professor exhaled sharply at the sensation but nodded in approval. Xander flexed his fingers, his shoulder protesting the movement. Kalos turned his attention to him next. "You are injured as well." "It's not urgent," Xander replied. Kalos didn't look convinced. "Your species has a tendency to dismiss damage until it worsens. This is inefficient." Victor let out a dry chuckle. "Welcome to human stubbornness." Kalos retrieved another device, this one emitting a faint blue glow. "This will limit inflammation and prevent internal bleeding." Xander hesitated, then relented, allowing Kalos to press the device against his shoulder. A cool sensation spread across the area, dulling the pain. Victor clapped his hands together. "All right, now that we're patched up, we need to move." Harding gritted his teeth, pushing himself upright with Victor's help. His leg held, though he leaned heavily on one of his assistants. Kalos surveyed the landscape. "There is an alternate route to your outpost, but it is longer. However, it avoids the unstable ground near the collapse." Xander nodded. "We'll take the safer route." The group set off, moving cautiously across the uneven terrain. The Zilvaar took turns supporting Harding, their long limbs making it easier to distribute his weight. As they walked, Kalos observed Xander closely. "Your actions within the cave contradict our understanding of survival instincts." Xander side-eyed him. "How so?" "You prioritized others over yourself, despite the risk. Statistically, individual survival is more likely when self-preservation takes precedence." Victor snorted. "Yeah, well, humans don't always do what's statistically smart." Kalos was silent for a moment before saying, "This is an anomaly." Xander smirked. "You'll get used to it." They pressed on, the outpost still a distant glimmer on the horizon. Xander adjusted his grip on the strap of his harness, his injured shoulder protesting with every step. The rough terrain forced them into a slow, measured pace. Professor Harding leaned heavily on one of his assistants, his breathing steady but strained. Kalos moved alongside Xander, his elongated limbs navigating the uneven ground with ease. His bioluminescent markings pulsed in a pattern that Xander suspected indicated concentration. The wind picked up, stirring loose dust into the air. Xander squinted ahead, scanning for any sign of shifting ground. The last thing they needed was another cave-in or unexpected drop. Victor, walking just ahead, exhaled sharply. The outpost is still a ways off. Harding, how's the pain? Harding's jaw tightened. Manageable. Victor didn't look convinced, but didn't press further. Kalos observed Harding for a moment before addressing Xander. Your species has limited regenerative capabilities compared to others in the known systems. Your reliance on external medical intervention is notable. Xander shifted the strap again, trying to ease the pressure on his shoulder. Yeah, well, we make do with what we have. One of the others, Zilvaar, a shorter one with more subdued markings, studied Xander's posture. Your injury is affecting your balance. Continued strain on compromised tissue will worsen damage. Xander exhaled through his nose. Noted. Kalos extended a thin, flexible, rod-like device from his pack and handed it over. This will stabilize your movement. Xander hesitated for only a second before taking it. The material had a slight give but was sturdy enough to support his weight. He pressed the end into the ground and immediately felt the difference in pressure distribution. Victor gave him a look. About time you accepted some help. Xander ignored him and pressed forward. The wind shifted again, carrying a faint vibration through the rock beneath their feet. Kalos stopped abruptly, tilting his head. Movement, he said. Something is shifting below us. Victor scanned the ground. Another collapse? Kalos crouched, extending one of his limbs to press against the stone. His markings flickered in rapid succession. No, this is different. Xander stiffened. Define different. A deep, distant groan rumbled through the landscape. The Zilvaar students tensed. Harding gritted his teeth. We don't have time for this. Kalos rose. We must move faster. Victor adjusted his grip on Harding. Then let's go. They pushed forward, quickening their pace despite the strain. Every step sent a dull ache through Xander's shoulder, but he ignored it. Kalos remained close, his focus flicking between the terrain and Xander. Your pain tolerance is disproportionately high compared to your physiological limits. Xander kept moving. Pain doesn't mean stop, it just means be careful. The groaning beneath them grew fainter as they gained distance. Victor glanced at Kalos. Is it following us? Kalos' markings dimmed slightly. Unclear. They moved in silence for a while, the tension thick between them. Harding's breathing became more labored, and Victor slowed briefly to check on him. Kalos spoke without turning. He requires rest. Victor's lips pressed into a thin line. We stop for too long, he won't get back up. Xander scanned the horizon. The outpost was still too far, but they needed a plan. Kalos considered this. There is a ridge ahead. It will provide shelter. Xander nodded. Then that's our next stop. They pressed on, the ridge looming closer. The ground remained stable, though Xander remained wary. When they reached the shelter of the rock formation, Victor helped Harding ease down against the stone. The professor exhaled sharply, sweat beading on his forehead. Kalos crouched beside him, retrieving another medical device. His condition is worsening. Victor wiped his brow. We need to get him back now. Kalos adjusted the device on Harding's leg. This will slow further deterioration, but he cannot remain mobile much longer. Xander rolled his shoulder, testing the pain. Then we carry him the rest of the way. Kalos' markings flickered in a pattern Xander was beginning to associate with skepticism. That is not efficient. Xander adjusted his stance. It's not about efficiency. It's about getting him home. Kalos regarded him for a long moment before nodding. Then we will assist. Victor glanced at Xander. Think you can manage? Xander flexed his fingers. We don't have a choice. Kalos and the other Zilvaar moved into position, their elongated limbs making it easier to distribute Harding's weight. Xander took a steadying breath. Let's move. They lifted Harding carefully, ensuring minimal strain on his injury, and pressed forward. The outpost was waiting. Xander adjusted his grip as he and Victor carried Harding forward. The Zilvaar students moved alongside them, their elongated limbs distributing the professor's weight in ways that helped ease the strain. The ridge had given them a brief reprieve, but they needed to keep moving. The outpost was still too far for comfort. Victor's breathing was steady, but Xander knew the exertion was wearing on him. His own injured shoulder ached under the weight, but stopping wasn't an option. Harding's leg was stabilized for now, but shock and exhaustion were pressing in. Kalos moved ahead, scanning the terrain. His bioluminescent markings pulsed in a new pattern, one that Xander hadn't seen before. Another Zilvaar student adjusted the grip on Harding's opposite side, their movements efficient but not hurried. "The temperature is dropping," Kalos noted. "This climate shift may cause complications." Victor exhaled sharply. "We keep moving." Harding stirred, his voice rough. "I can still—" "No," Xander cut in. "We're carrying you." End of discussion. The professor didn't argue. His breathing had become slightly more labored, and Xander could feel how much of his weight was sinking onto them. Kalos observed Harding closely. His circulation is slowing. Movement is necessary, but prolonged strain will worsen his condition. Victor's jaw tightened. "We know." One of the Zilvaar students adjusted a small device on Harding's arm. The faint hum of a monitor activated, and they studied the readings. "His blood flow is compromised. If it slows further, tissue damage will escalate beyond recovery." Xander felt the weight of that statement settle between them. They were running out of time. Kalos flicked his gaze to Xander. "You are also experiencing strain." Xander didn't bother answering. It wasn't relevant. Kalos considered him for a moment longer before turning back to the path ahead. "There is an incline ahead. It will slow progress further." Victor glanced up. "How steep?" Kalos didn't hesitate. "Unfavorable for carrying additional weight." Xander exhaled sharply through his nose. "We'll manage." As they reached the incline, the ground became more uneven. The Zilvaar adjusted their positioning, shifting Harding's weight more evenly between them all. Xander felt the strain in his injured shoulder intensify, but he kept his steps steady. Victor kept his focus ahead. "We get over this, it's a straight shot to the outpost." Kalos moved with precise steps, his attention divided between Harding's condition and the path ahead. The Zilvaar students adapted quickly, adjusting their movements to keep Harding as stable as possible. Halfway up the incline, Harding's breathing hitched. His grip on Xander's shoulder tightened briefly before weakening. Kalos reacted instantly, retrieving another medical device and pressing it against Harding's forearm. The readings shifted slightly, but not enough to be reassuring. The other Zilvaar student adjusted the pressure band on Harding's leg, ensuring circulation remained as stable as possible. Victor's expression darkened. "How bad?" Kalos didn't answer immediately. "His body is prioritizing core function. If we do not reach medical intervention soon, organ stress will follow." Xander's grip tightened. "Then we move faster." The incline leveled out after several agonizing steps, and Xander felt the relief in his muscles. The Zilvaar students were already adapting, adjusting their movements again now that the terrain was more stable. Kalos checked the readings once more. He is still conscious, but only marginally. Victor's voice was tight. "We're almost there." Xander could see the outpost now, the structure standing against the rocky landscape. It wasn't much farther, but every second counted. Kalos exchanged a brief glance with one of the other Zilvaar, then turned his focus back to Harding. "We will accelerate pace." Without warning, the Zilvaar adjusted their positioning again, redistributing Harding's weight in a way that allowed them to move faster. Xander and Victor kept up, matching their pace despite the strain. The last stretch was a blur of movement and controlled urgency. As they finally reached the outpost, the doors slid open, and the medical team rushed forward. Xander and Victor stepped back as Harding was carefully transferred to a stretcher. The Zilvaar students remained close, their focus still sharp. Kalos watched as the medical team worked, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he turned to Xander. "Your endurance exceeds expectation." Xander rolled his shoulder, feeling the exhaustion settle in. "Yeah, well, we don't quit easy." Kalos studied him for a moment longer before nodding. "I am beginning to understand." The outpost's medical facility was a narrow, sterile space, filled with the hume of diagnostic scanners and the faint scent of antiseptic. Xander sat on the edge of a cot, rolling his injured shoulder experimentally. The cooling effect from the Zilvaar device had faded, leaving behind a deep, persistent ache. Across the room, Victor leaned against a supply cabinet, his arms crossed as he watched the medical team work on Harding. Kalos stood nearby, his bioluminescent markings dimmed. One of the medics moved past him, barely sparing a glance at the alien observers. The Zilvaar students had remained since their arrival, their quiet presence a stark contrast to the controlled urgency of the human medical team. Harding lay on a diagnostic bed, his face pale but his breathing steadier than before. A medic adjusted the intravenous fluids running into his arm, while another monitored the readings displayed on a nearby screen. The pressure band the Zilvaar had applied was still in place, preventing further damage. One of the doctors turned away from the monitor and approached Xander with a medical scanner. He barely glanced at the alien students before focusing on Xander's shoulder. The scanner emitted a soft hum as it passed over the injury. Bruising, some strain to the deltoid and trapezius, but no fractures, the doctor said. You'll be sore for a while, but you're lucky. Xander exhaled through his nose as the doctor applied a localized anti-inflammatory patch. The relief was immediate, but a dull stiffness remained. Victor finally pushed off the cabinet. And Harding? The doctor glanced back. Circulation to the leg is stable, but tissue damage is still a concern. We'll keep monitoring for any complications, but he should recover with proper care. Kalos had been silent, watching the human procedures with unwavering focus. Now, his gaze shifted to the doctor. Your medical interventions are reactive rather than preventative. Why was his condition allowed to deteriorate to such a degree before stabilization? The doctor frowned slightly but answered without hesitation. We didn't have the resources in the field. Once we got him here, we could intervene properly. Kalos seemed to consider this. Your adaptability is notable, but it is inefficient. Your species is biologically fragile compared to others, yet you persist without hesitation. Victor let out a short breath. We don't exactly have a choice. Another Zilvaar student stepped forward. You faced a high probability of failure, yet you did not alter your course of action. Xander flexed his fingers, testing the lingering stiffness. Because failure wasn't an option. Kalos studied him for a long moment. You prioritize others above yourself, even at great risk. Our understanding of your species predicted hesitation in such circumstances. Your actions contradict those projections. Victor glanced at Xander before answering. Humans don't freeze up when it matters. We act. Kalos's bioluminescent markings shifted in a slow, deliberate pattern. You do not behave as expected. Xander met his gaze. Then maybe your expectations were wrong. Kalos didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned back to where Harding lay, his breathing steady, his vitals stabilizing. The Zilvaar students exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. After a long pause, Kalos finally spoke again. We must reassess our understanding of human behavior. Victor gave a tired half smile. Yeah, good luck with that. Kalos inclined his head slightly, an acknowledgement rather than agreement. The Zilvaar students remained still for another moment before finally stepping back, their bioluminescent patterns flickering in quiet contemplation. Outside, the wind howled against the outpost walls. Inside, the humans had already moved on to the next task, tending to wounds, preparing for the next challenge, never stopping. Kalos observed this, saying nothing, but something in his stance had shifted.